Joining me now is Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, author of the Bill of Obligations, the 10 Habits of Good Citizens. Richard, thanks for being here. I want to get your sort of help for folks to understand the significance of this announcement, at least by Vladimir Putin at this time, the suspension of the New START treaty and what that means. Does it mean, do you expect that Russia would begin to expand its nuclear arsenal, or is this just sort of a rhetorical threat?
It actually doesn't mean that much. The agreement has 4 years to go, Peter. The Russians are not going to break out. They said they would continue to honor the limits. They've already stopped most cooperation with inspectors. So what they've essentially done is stop what they've already stopped. So I don't think it's all that significant. In 4 years, we're going to have a big question. What do we put in its place?
Right.
And there's questions about new weapon systems, Chinese participation. That's when the real issues come. But in the short run, it doesn't really change a whole lot. And I think it also reflects the reality that Russia's last remaining vestige of being a great power, besides energy, is nuclear weapons. So I think their enthusiasm for restraining nuclear weapons is limited.
So how much, I guess, perhaps does it say in terms of the damage done to the relationship between the United States and Russia right now? Clearly, they have bigger issues, what's going on in Russia. But, I mean, this only escalates the tension between the two sides.
Yeah, there's essentially no relationship. Let's call a spade a spade. This is one of the last vestiges of the previous relationship. It's on life support, but there isn't really much of any relationship anymore.
How worried do you think China is about the announcement by Vladimir Putin today?
Well, I don't think they're that worried. I think they're more worried about the direction of the war. China cast its lot with Russia, so Xi Jinping has put his prestige on the line. It's almost the equivalent of a bad investment so far. And I think the most interesting question of the next few days and weeks is, does China ramp up its support for Russia? I think there's a decent chance it might. It doesn't mind this war continuing. It kind of bleeds the readiness militarily of the United States. It certainly doesn't want Russia to lose.
Right.
That would be bad for China. So I think that's the place to look.
Richard, it was really striking to hear from Antony Blinken on Meet the Press. I was a part of Chuck's panel here over the weekend where he basically made this accusation that China is considering providing lethal aid, weapons, to Russia right now. When pressed, he didn't provide any particular evidence. He seemed to say they would be reading in allies in the days ahead, but he wasn't specific about that as well. How, obviously, that would be a huge escalation were China to do this right now. How concerned do you think the U.S. should be that China is serious about considering to do something like that, and that that's a real problem that could be on the doorstep?
Oh, it is real, and that guarantees this would be a prolonged war. I think that's likely anyhow. But one of the hopes people like me had is even if the war is long-term, it would dial down in its intensity. If China begins to feed the Russian war machine, that puts a lot more pressure on Ukraine and indirectly on the rest of NATO, including ourselves. And I think it's possible. I think China basically dismisses the possibility of an improved relationship with the United States. They see what's going on here. They simply see no chance of it. And I really don't think there's that many penalties left to impose. Indeed, the Europeans may be reluctant to introduce certain economic penalties because several of them are so dependent on trade with China.
And Richard, according to the latest NBC News poll, I think the number is roughly 41% of Americans right now say that they are satisfied by President Biden's handling of this war. That means that most are not. There are no U.S. boots on the ground, but maybe $100 billion has been spent, about $30 billion in direct military aid to Ukraine right now. How as a president, how as an administration, do you not just win over Mitch McConnell, who said this is critical, we got to stick to it, it's the most important effort in the world, but the American people right now who may be experiencing a type of fatigue by the amount of money and the effort that's being spent overseas?
I actually don't read it that way, Peter. I think, first of all, the president has the support of Republicans, most Republicans in Congress, as well as most Democrats. I actually think that poll is very close to the overall numbers on President Biden. It's almost an approval-disapproval number. I don't think Americans are hanging on the latest news from Ukraine. I'd be surprised if most Americans, if any Americans, essentially voted on the basis of our Ukraine policy at the midterms. And I actually think the president's done a good job. So I don't take that poll all that seriously.
All right. Yeah, appreciate your thoughts on that and your perspective always. Richard Haass, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.